My son Arthur called me on a brisk Tuesday morning. His voice carried the casual, detached tone of a man canceling a dentist appointment rather than altering the course of our family history. "Dad, we forgot to tell you, we moved to California last weekend." I held the phone to my ear, remaining perfectly silent for exactly 7 seconds. For a normal father, 7 seconds might be a moment of shock, a pause to process heartbreak. But I am not a normal father. For an ex-NSA cryptographer and the architect of the world's most advanced financial security networks, 7 seconds is an eternity. It is enough time to process millions of variables, calculate probabilities, and identify the exact shape of a betrayal. An interstate relocation, a pregnant wife, a complete uprooting of their lives. These are not trivial details that simply slip a son's mind. They had orchestrated this for months. They had packed their belongings, liquidated their local assets, and vanished like ghosts, deliberately leaving me stranded in an empty, echoing house. It was a calculated campaign of isolation. They wanted me alone. They wanted me vulnerable. "All right, Arthur," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Good luck," and I ended the call. "Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. I am Victor Vance. I never imagined the day would come when I would have to treat my own son as a hostile threat." If you have ever trusted someone completely, only to watch them dismantle your life from the inside, leave a number 1 in the comments so I can begin this story, and make sure you hit subscribe. You are going to want to hear every detail of this. I placed my phone on the polished mahogany desk. The dry mechanical click of the disconnecting call resonated through my silent office. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. The betrayal didn't break my heart. It simply triggered a deeply ingrained psychological defense protocol. When you spend decades analyzing malicious code and dismantling digital espionage rings, you learn to view human relationships through a specific lens. When a piece of code becomes corrupted, you don't mourn it. You isolate the infected sector, you analyze the breach, and you initiate a systemic purge. Arthur and his wife, Elena, believed they had executed the perfect extraction. They thought 3,000 miles of distance would erase their digital fingerprints. But they forgot the fundamental truth of the modern world. Every action leaves a trace. And more importantly, they forgot who I was. I spent 30 years building the invisible architecture that protects global wealth. I understand how deception is structured. I know exactly how thieves operate when they think the lights are out. The moment that call ended, a new algorithm in my mind went online. I stood up from my desk, the silence of the house suddenly feeling heavy and toxic. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a retirement home. It was the sterile emptiness of a crime scene. I walked down the long, shadowed hallway toward the master bedroom. My destination was a heavy, antique bookshelf bolted to the wall. Behind the third row of leather-bound encyclopedias was a biometric titanium safe, reinforced with a secondary kinetic lock. It was the vault where I stored my most critical assets: property deeds, offshore routing numbers, and most importantly, my absolute medical power of attorney. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. A green light flashed, and the heavy door hissed open. The vault was completely empty. Every single document, every encrypted hard drive, every legal folder had been stripped away. They had hollowed it out. I stood there, my resting heart rate barely fluctuating. I wasn't surprised. I was simply confirming a hypothesis. My perimeter had been breached by an inside threat. My mind instantly shifted into forensic reconstruction mode. I rewound my memory back exactly 21 days. It was a rainy Sunday evening. Elena, my seemingly devoted daughter-in-law, had walked into my study with a warm cup of herbal tea and a feather duster. Her smile was radiant, perfectly practiced. "Victor, let me tidy up in here. You've been working so hard. The dust is just piling up," she had cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I had been deeply engrossed in a complex quantum encryption matrix, so I simply nodded and stepped out onto the patio for some fresh air. I was gone for exactly 4 minutes. When I returned, Elena was standing unnervingly close to the bookshelf. She flinched, her eyes darting toward the door, before she quickly began dusting a random encyclopedia. Now, staring into the dark void of the empty safe, the puzzle pieces snapped violently into place. Elena hadn't been cleaning. She had planted a microscopic optical scanner on the spine of a book, recording the exact kinetic sequence and biometric angle I used to access the vault. The sweet, caring woman I had welcomed into my home was in reality a highly efficient domestic parasite. The depth of this betrayal was staggering. Arthur had provided the layout and my schedule. Elena had executed the infiltration. Together, they formed a perfect symbiotic unit designed to bleed me dry. By stealing my medical power of attorney, they held the ultimate weapon. In the eyes of the law, they could declare me cognitively unfit at any moment. They could quietly commit me to a high-security psychiatric facility, seize total control of my assets, and liquidate my life's work. They thought they had acquired the master keys to the kingdom. They believed I was just a fading old man, completely obsolete, waiting to wither away in a sprawling, empty mansion. But Arthur and Elena had made the catastrophic mistake of amateur hackers. They assumed the interface was the entire machine. They had no idea that to a master cryptographer, physical paper documents are nothing more than a decoy. The true authorization codes, the biometric master keys that controlled the lifeblood of my wealth, were embedded in a secondary, invisible layer of security they could never fathom. I closed the empty safe, making sure to leave no indication that I had discovered the theft. I walked back to my study. Arthur was a clever boy, but he was merely a user operating within a system I had architected. Before they fled, Arthur had logged into the central security hub and wiped the entire surveillance history of the past 4 months. He thought he had scrubbed the timeline clean. He had forgotten that a paranoid intelligence operative never relies on a single network. 10 years ago, when I laid the foundation for this house, I embedded a subterranean, air-gapped server room directly into the bedrock beneath the basement. It had no wireless capability. It was completely isolated from the main grid, tethered to the surface only by a physical fiber optic line woven into the plumbing architecture. I walked to the heavy oak paneling behind my desk, pressed a sequence of concealed pressure plates, and a small high-resolution monitor slid out from the wood. I typed in a 40-character alphanumeric decryption key. The air-gapped system hummed to life, pulling data from the subterranean vault. Every deleted file, every wiped frame of video, rapidly populated on the screen. I scrubbed through the timeline to 2:14 a.m. on the night of the breach. The infrared camera feed bathed the study in a ghostly green light. Arthur was standing by the door, his entire body rigid with nervous energy, constantly checking the hallway. Meanwhile, Elena was kneeling before the open safe. She didn't look nervous. She looked euphoric. Her hands moved with clinical precision as she emptied the folders into a black duffel bag. Then, the high-fidelity directional microphone picked up a whisper. Elena leaned close to Arthur, her voice a venomous hiss. "We have it all. The old man is basically a zombie anyway. A few more weeks of those drops in his morning tea, and his brain will turn to mush. We'll own the entire estate before Christmas." I froze the frame. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated greed. I analyzed the audio, those drops in his morning tea. A cold wave of realization washed over me. This wasn't just a financial extraction. It was a slow-motion assassination. I stood up and walked steadily to the kitchen. On the marble counter sat my customized tea infuser, and right beside it, a small amber dropper bottle that Elena had affectionately told me was a rare herbal tincture for joint pain. She had insisted on preparing my morning tea every single day, playing the role of the devoted caregiver to absolute perfection. I took the amber bottle back to my study and placed it into a portable, military-grade mass spectrometer I kept for analyzing physical security threats. The machine whirred, breaking down the chemical composition of the liquid. 2 minutes later, the terrifying truth materialized on the screen. It wasn't an herbal supplement. It was an advanced, synthesized neuroinhibitor, a highly restricted chemical compound designed to slowly degrade the neural pathways in the frontal lobe. Administered in small, daily doses, it mimicked the aggressive onset of severe dementia. It caused memory fragmentation, disorientation, and a complete loss of critical reasoning. They were systematically melting my brain at my own breakfast table, turning me into a compliant vegetable so they could seamlessly execute their legal takeover. Their timeline was sickeningly perfect. Elena had recently announced her pregnancy. The impending arrival of a child was the catalyst they needed to accelerate the plan. They were impatient, they wanted their inheritance immediately, and they were willing to poison the grandfather of their unborn child to get it. I looked at my reflection in the dark monitor. My pulse was completely steady. My eyes were as cold and sharp as fractured obsidian. I wasn't terrified. I was highly operational. When a malicious virus infiltrates a critical system, you don't just delete it. You trace the signal back to the host server, and you annihilate the source code. My biological scans indicated that the neuroinhibitor hadn't caused permanent damage yet, primarily because my paranoid habit of heavily filtering my water had diluted the toxin's efficacy. My mind was completely lucid. I could see the entire chessboard, and my opponents had just left their king completely exposed. Arthur and Elena were celebrating in California, convinced they had stolen the future. They didn't know that the system architect was about to execute a hard reset. I accessed the encrypted GPS transponder embedded in the chassis of the luxury SUV I had bought Arthur for his birthday. A red blinking dot illuminated on the digital map, hovering over an exclusive, ultra-wealthy enclave in Silicon Valley. The simulation in New York was over. It was time for the creator to step into the real world and reclaim his assets. 3 hours later, my private Gulfstream G650 tore through the clouds, leaving the East Coast behind. I sat in the dimly lit cabin, reviewing data streams. I hadn't packed a single bag. I carried only a heavily fortified laptop containing the master overrides for my global network. I wasn't flying to California to confront my son. I was flying there to financially decapitate him when the jet touched down on a private airstrip in San Jose. 2 figures were waiting beside a heavily tinted security vehicle. The first was Marcus, a former CIA operative who now ran the most ruthless private intelligence firm on the West Coast. The second was Evelyn, a corporate litigator whose name made Fortune 500 CEOs break out in a cold sweat. I stepped into the vehicle. There were no pleasantries. I handed Marcus a decrypted drive. Target profiles: Arthur and Elena Vance. I need a comprehensive map of every financial transaction, every real estate acquisition, and every wire transfer they've initiated in the last 30 days. Rip their digital lives apart. Marcus nodded and connected the drive to his tactical terminal. Within 15 minutes, the data began to flow. The picture that emerged was a masterpiece of financial fraud. Arthur hadn't used his own money to fund their luxurious escape. 2 months ago, he had forged my digital signature to authorize a massive withdrawal from one of my secondary corporate holding accounts. The money had been funneled through a labyrinth of shell companies in the Cayman Islands before materializing in a Californian trust fund. They had used $12 million of my stolen capital to purchase a sprawling, cliffside mansion overlooking the Pacific Ocean. But their ambition didn't stop at real estate. Evelyn reviewed a secondary dossier that Marcus had pulled from the state's secure legal registry. Her sharp eyes narrowed. "Victor, they're moving incredibly fast," she said, her voice laced with professional disgust. They used the forged medical incompetence certificate, combined with the stolen power of attorney, to secure an immense line of credit from Pacific Standard Bank. They pledged your controlling shares in the tech firm as collateral. They're sitting on $15 million in liquid capital, and they're preparing to use it. They had weaponized my wealth against me. They had used the poison to buy time, and the documents to buy a kingdom. The son I had nurtured and protected had meticulously priced my life at exactly $27 million. I watched the palm trees blur past the reinforced windows. I didn't scream. I didn't rage. My anger crystallized into a purely mathematical equation of destruction. They thought the $15 million was their golden ticket into the elite echelons of Silicon Valley. They believed they had permanently locked me away in a mental prison. They had no idea they had just walked into a cryptographic snare. "Marcus," I said softly, my eyes never leaving the window. "Find the medical practitioner who signed that incompetence certificate. Find him tonight." The black SUV glided to a halt in the alleyway behind a high-end private medical clinic in downtown San Francisco. It was nearly midnight, but a single light burned in the corner office on the top floor. Marcus bypassed the electronic security locks with a brute force decryption key in under 40 seconds. We moved through the sterile, silent corridors like shadows. We opened the door to the office. Dr. Julian Vance, no relation. A tragic irony looked up from his mahogany desk, his face instantly draining of color. He was a prestigious neurologist, a man whose signature commanded absolute authority in a courtroom. But the man standing before him was not the drooling, cognitively collapsed patient described in his fraudulent report. I stood tall, perfectly composed, radiating an aura of lethal clarity. How did you get in here? Dr. Julian stammered, instinctively reaching for the panic button under his desk. Marcus stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on the doctor's wrist, pinning it to the wood. With his other hand, Marcus flipped open a laptop and rotated the screen toward the doctor. Displayed on the monitor was the complete, highly classified ledger of a dark web cryptocurrency exchange. A specific wallet address was highlighted in neon red. It showed a massive accumulated debt linked to illegal underground offshore betting syndicates. 4 days ago, a deposit of exactly $500,000 miraculously wiped out your gambling debts. Doctor, Marcus said smoothly. The transaction was routed through an anonymous proxy, but the origin point was a shell corporation registered to Elena Vance. You sold your medical license and a man's life to save your kneecaps from the cartel. Doctor, Julian began to hyperventilate, the polished veneer of the esteemed medical professional completely shattered. He knew that if this ledger was handed to the DEA and the state medical board, he would spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. I stepped closer, my presence filling the room with an icy dread. I placed a blank sheet of clinic letterhead and an expensive fountain pen on the desk. You are going to write a meticulously detailed confession, I commanded, my voice slicing through the silence. You will document the exact nature of the bribe. You will detail how Elena Vance procured the neuroinhibitor and how you falsified the medical evaluation without ever seeing me. You will sign it, stamp it, and surrender your digital logs. Julian picked up the pen. His hands shook so violently he could barely form the letters. Survival instinct had completely overridden his loyalty to his co-conspirators. He wrote the confession, weeping silently as he documented his own professional suicide. 10 minutes later, I folded the signed, notarized confession and placed it into the breast pocket of my suit. The ultimate kill switch to their legal authority was now in my possession. But handing it to the police immediately would lack poetic justice. I didn't just want them arrested. I wanted them to experience the exact moment their artificial paradise collapsed into hellfire. I turned back to the trembling doctor before walking out. You will attend your clinic tomorrow as usual. If you attempt to flee, or if you contact Arthur or Elena, the cartel will receive your new location coordinates before the FBI does. We returned to the tactical vehicle. Evelyn looked at me, her legal mind already assembling the prosecution. We have the confession, Victor. We can freeze their assets right now. I shook my head, a thin, predatory smile touching the corners of my mouth. No, we let them execute their grand finale, let them sign the papers. The higher they climb, the more bones they break when they fall. The poison pill protocol was armed. In the architecture of advanced network security, a poison pill is a catastrophic defense mechanism. When an unauthorized user attempts a hostile takeover, the system doesn't just block them. It actively corrupts their resources, locks them inside the network, and alerts the authorities. Arthur and Elena believed the $15 million they had secured was legitimate. They were planning to use it the very next evening to acquire a massive, highly lucrative artificial intelligence startup in Silicon Valley. It was a brilliant strategy to launder the stolen funds and cement their status as tech elite billionaires. What my arrogant son didn't know was that the startup they were aggressively trying to acquire was secretly owned by one of my own phantom holding companies. They were literally trying to buy my own company using my stolen money. Furthermore, they were unaware of the ultimate biometric failsafe I had engineered into the banking infrastructure. Any transaction exceeding $10 million, regardless of legal paperwork or power of attorney, required a live, quantum-encrypted retinal scan from the primary account holder to authorize the final release of funds. The money they thought they had was currently suspended in a cryptographic escrow. I leaned back in the leather seat of the SUV as we merged onto the highway. We let the gala proceed tomorrow night. We let them sign the acquisition contract. The moment they forge that final signature attempting to transfer non-existent funds, it escalates from a familial civil dispute to a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy. The trap was perfectly set. The system was about to purge its corrupted elements. If you are still following this meticulous dismantling of a betrayal, do me a favor. Hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a number 5 in the comments to let me know you've made it to the climax of the story. And tell me if you would have the icy resolve to do the same to your own flesh and blood. Thursday night arrived, bringing with it a spectacular sunset over the Pacific Ocean. The Vance estate in Silicon Valley was ablaze with light. A massive, ostentatious gala was in full swing, swarming with tech moguls, venture capitalists, and the elite of California high society. Arthur moved through the crowd like a conquering king. He wore a bespoke tuxedo, his chest puffed out with unearned arrogance. Elena glided beside him in a glittering emerald gown, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. She played the role of the visionary tech wife to absolute perfection. In the center of the grand ballroom, surrounded by eager investors, sat a glowing digital interface where the final acquisition contract for the AI startup awaited their signature. I was not inside. I sat in the command center of a black surveillance van parked on a bluff overlooking the estate. Marcus sat beside me, operating a complex array of decryption algorithms and audio interceptors. We were tapped directly into the mansion's internal network. Every word, every laugh, every clink of crystal champagne glasses poured into my headset. "Arthur, you are making a brilliant play here," the lead negotiator for the startup said, his voice dripping with sycophantic praise. "Acquiring this architecture will make you a titan." "I've always had a vision for the future," Arthur replied smoothly, his voice a sickening echo of my own confidence. "My father built a decent foundation, but he lacked the aggression to truly evolve. It's time for the new generation to take the reins. We have the 15 million in escrow, ready for immediate transfer." Elena laughed, a sharp, crystalline sound. "We simply accelerated the inevitable. Progress requires bold action." I stared at the live video feed. They were beautiful, radiant, and utterly hollow. They were standing on a fragile pane of glass, convinced it was solid bedrock. I glanced at the chronometer on the monitor. "It was time, execute," I whispered. Inside the ballroom, the negotiator handed Arthur a digital stylus. "Just your signature, Mr. Vance, and the smart contract will execute the transfer." Arthur didn't hesitate. He didn't feel a flicker of guilt for the father he believed was drooling in a wheelchair on the other side of the country. He pressed the stylus to the screen and signed his name with an elegant flourish. Elena beamed, wrapping her arms around his neck in triumph. The system processed the signature. A green loading bar appeared on the massive display screen behind them. The room fell into a hush of anticipation. Then, the firewall slammed shut. The ambient lighting in the ballroom suddenly shifted from a warm gold to a glaring, harsh crimson. The soft classical music instantly cut out, replaced by a blaring digitized alarm tone. The massive display screen glitched, the green loading bar turning a violent shade of red. A massive text overlay appeared on the screen, visible to every billionaire and investor in the room. "Critical error to transcendentaligned biometric. Federal fraud protocol initiated." Arthur staggered backward, dropping the stylus as if it had electrocuted him. The smug, triumphant smile vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of absolute horror. What is this? There's a glitch!" Arthur shouted, frantically tapping the screen. "The funds are there. I have the power of attorney." Elena's face drained of color. She grabbed her phone, frantically dialing their private banker. The call went straight to a disconnected tone. The chaos in the ballroom erupted. The tech elites immediately began backing away, their self-preservation instincts recognizing the smell of financial death. Before Arthur could attempt another frantic override, the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom burst open. The red and blue strobe lights of dozens of police cruisers painted the walls from outside. A heavily armed tactical team of FBI agents swarmed into the room, their boots echoing like thunder against the marble floor. "Nobody move, federal agents. Step away from the terminal," the lead agent roared, his voice cutting through the panic. Arthur froze, his hands raised in the air, his entire body shaking violently. Elena screamed, clutching her stomach, her emerald gown suddenly looking like a prison uniform. The crowd parted violently as I walked through the main entrance. I wore a perfectly tailored black suit, my posture rigid, my expression completely unreadable. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the rhythmic click of my shoes as I walked slowly, deliberately, toward the center of the room. Arthur looked up. His eyes widened to impossible proportions. He saw the father he believed he had chemically lobotomized standing before him, radiating the lethal, calculated energy of a predator who had just cornered its prey. "Dad," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking, tears instantly welling in his eyes. How are you here?" Elena stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes darting frantically for an exit that didn't exist. She looked at me as if she were staring at a ghost that had crawled out of the grave to drag her to hell. I stopped 3 feet away from them. I didn't yell, I didn't exhibit a single ounce of rage. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You forgot to tell me you were moving, Arthur," I said. My voice quiet, but carrying the concussive force of a detonating bomb. "And I forgot to tell you that I own the company you just tried to buy with my stolen money." The realization hit them like a physical blow. They hadn't just been caught. They had been masterfully engineered into an inescapable trap. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, holding up a thick dossier. "Arthur Vance, Elena Vance, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder via chemical poisoning." The heavy cold steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly in the silent room as they were secured around my son's wrists. Arthur fell to his knees, openly sobbing, begging for forgiveness, pleading that it was all a terrible mistake. Elena shrieked as she was detained, her glamorous facade completely disintegrating into an ugly, desperate panic. They had lost the game the very moment they believed they had won it. Their artificial empire had collapsed into dust, erased by the very system they thought they had outsmarted. The FBI escorted them out of the mansion, parading them in front of the flashing cameras of the local news crews who had mysteriously been tipped off. The elite society they had so desperately tried to infiltrate watched them being hauled away in disgrace. The grand ballroom slowly emptied until I was the only one left standing amidst the discarded champagne flutes and shattered illusions. The purge was complete. The malicious code had been isolated, quarantined, and permanently deleted from my life. The tragedy of Arthur and Elena was not their greed, but their profound arrogance. They had underestimated the clarity of my mind and drastically overestimated their own intelligence. The justice system is notoriously unforgiving when it comes to federal financial crimes, and even less so when those crimes are intertwined with premeditated biological harm. Evelyn, my attorney, informed me that given the irrefutable evidence of the neuroinhibitor and the forged documents, they were both facing a minimum of 25 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. It was a severe, devastating consequence, but it was the exact price they had chosen to pay when they placed a monetary value on the sanctity of family. The next morning, I sat in Evelyn's high-rise office in San Francisco, looking out over the sprawling city. I signed a newly drafted, ironclad last will and testament. Arthur's name was systematically eradicated from every trust, every holding company, and every inheritance provision I possessed. A corrupted subroutine must be entirely severed from the main network to protect the integrity of future generations. However, I am a man of logic, not a monster of blind vengeance. The child Elena was carrying was an innocent variable in this horrific equation. I instructed Evelyn to establish an impenetrable, independently managed trust fund in Switzerland, specifically for my unborn grandchild. The child would be raised by court-appointed guardians of my choosing, provided with elite education and unwavering support. But Arthur and Elena would never have access to a single cent of that wealth. They would watch their child thrive from behind reinforced glass and steel bars. As I walked out of the office and into the crisp California air, I felt a profound sense of closure. This ordeal had been a grueling stress test of my emotional and psychological defenses. It taught me the most agonizing lesson a father can learn. The most dangerous security vulnerabilities do not come from external hackers or rival corporations. They originate from within the firewall. Blood relation is not a guarantee of loyalty. The moment you lower your defenses, simply because someone carries your surname, is the moment you hand them the weapon they will use to destroy you.